Hi everyone. Today I want to talk to you about the APA style, and what I've done here is I've created an outline for a possible cause and effect essay on obesity. We have here all kinds of scenarios. I'm including source information that you're welcome to use. You will need 10 sources altogether for this APA assignment. But anyway, I want to go ahead and kind of go through this outline and hopefully clarify things that I didn't clarify in class, and also make something that you can refer back to when you need to. So, this again is an outline for an APA cause and effect argumentative paper. The paper is to be 2,500 words in length with 10 outside sources. It's going to be typed and double-spaced in Times New Roman in 12-point font. And this basic outline shows cause, problem, plus effects, plus solution style of essay. And you're going to see that there's all kinds of ways that you can interpret this. But the first thing that I want to talk about is the introduction. And so basically an introduction is a brief explanation of what is coming. Your thesis statement should appear in this paragraph, and usually it's the last line of the introduction, but that's not always the case. Some papers, it's the first sentence. But typically you do something that then leads into the thesis, which is again typically the last sentence of that introduction paragraph. And there are several great ways to start an essay, and I have a PowerPoint that shows this, and I am going to be making a recording of it. But for right now, there is one on the class. And so some choices are broad to narrow, which is truly the most common way to start an essay. You just start with the overall concept of how obesity is a huge problem for society at large, and then you gradually narrow it into whatever your point is. That's one way. Another is to start narrow and then broaden out. A way to do that would be perhaps with a story where you actually talk about a specific case. Maybe Jenny went to the doctor because she was having chest pains and, blah, 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 blah. And after running several tests and being in the hospital for 6 hours, Jenny learned that even though she's only 25, she is suffering from heart disease. That is a direct cause of the fact that she's 50 pounds overweight, whatever. So you actually start with the more narrow and broaden it out to something greater that then hopefully lures the audience in, makes them want to pay attention. My next point there is with a brief anecdote or story, which is sort of what I just told you in terms of narrow to broad. You could start narrow and broaden out. It wouldn't have to be with the story that you start. You could always start with some kind of a very specific statistic or some kind of a specific example that's not necessarily a story. But a story works great to draw people in, and it's definitely an option when you're writing an introduction. You can start with a famous quote. Keep in mind that if a quote is from a famous person, you don't have to cite them, especially if it's an old quote. Abe Lincoln, Henry Ford, somebody that lived way back. That stuff is considered common knowledge, and it does not need to be cited, and in fact it should not be cited or it shouldn't be counted one of your 10 sources, because it's just considered to be part of common knowledge. You can also start with a series of questions or one big question. How many of you are obese? Or how many people out there are considered obese and overweight, whatever. But some kind of a quote. How many people know someone that has suffered from or suffers from obesity? How many people know someone who has actually suffered some kind of a sickness as a result of being overweight, blah, 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 blah. And then you could always talk about how, next one with the startling fact, you could say obesity is the single most problematic cause of preventable disease in the world today. I don't know if that's a true statistic, but you could look that up and I bet you could corroborate it, that it's one of the few things that we can actually prevent do something about, that we kind of sit idly by and just lament, our plight and whatever. I'm sure there are other ways to start an essay, but these are some of the most common, and so it gives you a place to start if you're having time struggling with starting your introduction. Excuse me. Okay, so the problem that we have identified for this particular paper is obesity. And you can typically, when you're talking about problems, define the problem. And so I've defined it here, and actually I haven't. An online dictionary did. But it is a condition characterized by the excessive accumulation and storage of fat in the body. That's a very simple definition. Excuse me, I didn't bring any information about body mass index. You're welcome to do that if it lends itself to the overall purpose of your essay. I chose to just go with a broader definition of obesity. And I want to show you, and I'm just going to roll down to the sample references page that I've created with the sources that I've included in here. And I want you to see that right down here, right there, highlighted in the blue, is the source that information came from. When you cite from a dictionary, you do it by the word, obesity, and then this one came from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. You write it in Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, and then put the title of the website retrieved from the URL. And it's that simple. And then when you cite it, all you do is use these first two, I don't know if 2017's a word, but anyway, use these first two items so that if you included that definition in your paper, sorry, going too far, you would put it just as I have it here. Okay, and hopefully that makes sense. And, excuse me, this brings me to the idea of cross-referencing. The words that you use to cite sources in the body of the paper should cross-reference with the words that you alphabetize sources by on a references page. So you alphabetize by obesity, and you in-text citation, that's not really a verb, is it? You create an in-text citation. All right. So that's how you would incorporate a definition of a word from an online dictionary. It's also how you incorporate one from a book. You just you would just include slightly different information. But most of us use the online method just because it's easily at our fingertips. All right, Roman numeral 2. Look at the other side's perspective if there is one. For a paper like this, which I classify as a soft argument, you're basically building a case for what you think are the most common causes and effects of obesity. So you don't really need this part in a paper like this as much as you would for a paper, say, on the legalization of euthanasia of people, which is very controversial. It is up to you whether or not you include this, and it really depends on what your thesis ends up being. If you do present the other side's point of view, you want to do it in a way that they would agree with you. This means that you don't insult them, you don't accuse them of being dumb, you don't do anything like that. You just present their side clearly and fairly, and in a way that if you ask them to read it, they would say it matches with their way of thinking. So, in a paper like this, again, on obesity, where you're just kind of saying, these are what I think are the main causes of obesity, you go ahead and you present those causes, and in that way it's an argument, but it's different than if you're saying euthanasia definitely needs to be a policy incorporated across the, United States, right? And that is a real hard argument because there's going to be people that disagree with you, and so you would absolutely want to look at their perspective and say why it is that that is not a good idea. The next section would be where you look at the cause of the problem. So in this case, what is behind the obesity crisis? For this paper, I focused more on the idea of just looking at causes. But as I've said before, You're absolutely able to make this an effect paper where you focus solely on, or not solely, but mostly on the effects of obesity. For this one, as I said, I focused more on causes, and there's a bunch of causes, and as I was looking up information to support the causes, it occurred to me that any one of the causes could actually be expanded on, and you could write a whole paper on it. You know what I mean? Where you could just focus solely on eating problems, the eating aspect of obesity, whatever. So, the first point that we came up with in class actually is lack of exercise or sedentary lifestyle. And in parentheses there, I have put a sample in-text citation for one of the sources that is included on the references page called Physical Activity. It was printed or published in 2017. And so, again, just to show you an example of cross-referencing, I'm going to roll down to that references page and show you how alphabetically it's right here under the definition for obesity. And it includes the same information that any APA online source should include, which is the title, the year, the publisher, and then where it was retrieved from. And so when you cite it, you could theoretically just do physical if you wanted to, because nothing else starts that way. But I just went ahead and put Physical Activity. And notice how in text any of those titles are quoted. They have quotation marks around them, like obesity, you can see the quotation marks there. Physical Activity, there's quotation marks there, but yet they are not that way on the references page. APA is real specific about how titles of works that are short like that don't have anything on the references page, so no quotation marks, but you do put them in the body anytime you do an in-text citation. So for each of the points that you have, you want a topic sentence that sets up what's coming next. Support topics are sort of like mini essays, if you want to think about them that way, and they have a sentence that sets up the paragraph and then support for that topic sentence that clarifies and elaborates on it, and that's the support. So for lack of exercise, you might say something like this. One of the most obvious causes of obesity is lack of exercise. That would be your topic sentence because it's setting the stage for what's to come. Sedentary lifestyles have become more and more common as so many people work at sit-down jobs, drive everywhere they need to go, and spend much of their time in front of some kind of screen. Children play video games, adults and teens alike are glued to cell phones and computers rather than going for a walk or working out in the evening after their daily routines are done. Lack of exercise causes the body to go, quote, out of balance. That came from Physical Activity, 2017. The bottom line is that we eat more calories than we burn. That if we eat more calories than we burn, we will gain weight. Exercise is the defining factor when it comes to determining how much food we can consume. And that right there ends a whole section that came from the outside source, Physical Activity. I've talked before about the sandwich method of citing, so that you basically have the first reference to the outside source and you put a in-text citation following it, as we have here. Then we have all the other stuff that's summarized from that source. These are all summaries, by the way, except for stuff that has quotation marks around it. And then when I finished using stuff from that source, I ended it with another in-text citation. And again, it basically means that this little chunk right here came from or is paraphrased from the Physical Activity source that I've included on the references page. And don't forget, you guys, whenever you're dealing with physical activity stuff or any kind of outside source stuff, not physical activity, but any outside source stuff, it's important that even if you summarize or paraphrase, you give credit. You don't only give credit when it's a direct quote. You give credit when it's also a summary or a paraphrase. Okay, last of all for this intro, unfortunately many of us eat as though we ran 5 miles a day when we barely walked 500 feet. And that's just a little comment from me, okay? I'm going to stop here. and continue in the next video.